By definition, a wild plum isn't a specific species, but a loose grouping of members of the genus Prunus that resemble or are related to domesticated plums. Many of these plums have thorns and basal sprout. Here are some examples of all the wild plums native to the US that I could find. There are many, and for every region of the US you are in, I guarantee you there's a wild plum in your area. Many of these plums share common names, especially those which are named wild goose, hog, sand, or river plums. For this reason, we try to avoid using these names and call them by their Latin names instead. I'm not including the Indian plum, which inhabits the west coast, because it's not actually a plum. It's in a totally separate genus than the Prunus genus, so I will not include it on this list. Sadly, what we normally think of as a plum is not native to the US. Its Latin name is Prunus domesticata, meaning domesticated, and is native to Europe. There's also another cultivated variety called the Japanese plum, Prunus salicina, that can also be found outside of its normal range. There are many different varieties and subspecies of these plums, as whenever you let two trees sexually reproduce, they yield a genetically different seed that when sprouted tastes slightly different than both of its parents. Plums cross very easily, and this is why if you ever grow a tree from a fruit you bought at the store, it won't taste like the original one did exactly. Sometimes this can be very extreme, with the fruit from plants grown from store-bought seeds being dramatically smaller, not producing, or possibly tasting better or worse, or not making fruit at all. That's why, if you really want a domesticated plum, you should go to a nursery and buy one. A plum, like peaches and other stone fruit, is technically a subset of fruit types called a drupe, D-R-U-P-E, which has one hard seed per fruit. They're also called stone fruit, and they have a couple other different names. Prunes are a name for a dried plum, but like raisins, they're usually referring to a specific cultivar of fruit that's used in the drying process to get the final product. The first of these wild plums that we'll cover is arguably the most well-known, and is usually what you hear referred to as a wild plum if you live in its native range. It's called the American plum, or Prunus americana, and has an extensive range all the way from the Dakotas down to Georgia and back north to Massachusetts. There are even scattered sightings of this species as far west as Arizona and Utah. Most wild plum trees look pretty inconspicuous when they're not in bloom or when they're not fruiting. They might be misdiagnosed for an elm tree, which has a very similar leaf, or a hackberry. So the best time to look for them would be in the spring or fall. The American plum's fruits are round and turn red as they ripen, and the leaves are non-lobed with dense small veins, long narrow tips, and fine double-toothed margins. Twigs are orange-brown and its bark is dark brown and scaly. Buds are brownish-orangish and scaly, resembling a 3 to 5 layered hemlock cone. The fruit of the American plum is one of the largest of the native plums, being about 1 to 2 inches in diameter but varying widely. It makes up for these relatively small fruits by producing possibly thousands per tree, the entire tree being covered in flowers in the spring. The fruit is said to be juicy and sweet, with the skin being hard and having to spit the skin and the pit out when you eat it raw. They're commonly used in preserves, jams, brewing, and eaten raw. The American plum has some of the prettiest and most abundant flowers I've ever seen on a flowering tree. It grows quickly, stays relatively short, and can produce in the first 3 years. The only large problem with this tree is that it is very prone to basal sprouting, which is not a huge deal because you can usually just mow over them or cut them. But it's actually a plus if you want a living hedge like I do. And this hedge will flower, basically covering the entire hedge with bright white blooms in the spring, and then produce a ton of fruit. The second most well-known wild plum we'll cover is called the Canadian plum, or the black plum. Its Latin name is Prunus nigra. It shares much of its range with the American plum, but nowadays is less likely to be found at its southern extent, which is in Ohio and Illinois and Indiana, but can still be found abundantly in eastern Canada and the northeastern U.S.
The Canadian and American plums can be easily confused with each other because they share much of their range and they look very similar. One way to easily differentiate them is using the leaf margin. The American plum has sharply pointed, double serrated leaf margins, while the Canadian plum has blunted, serrated leaf margins. The bark is very smooth in its infancy, having lead cells horizontally arranged, but over time this will get plated and fall off. The buds, like the fruit, are very similar to the American and will not be of much use in identification. There should also, on the Canadian plum, be two small glands on the leaf petiole that are not found on the American plum. The fruit of the Canadian plum is very enjoyable, somewhat sour and very juicy, and like the American plum, is great for jams, jellies, but can also be eaten raw. The fruit is a similar size to the American, roughly 1 to 2 inches in diameter. The Canadian plum is highly valued for its flowers, which are used to pollinate cultivated and other wild plums because they last for the entire flowering phase of most plum cultivars. These flowers are just as abundant as the American plum, if not more so, and cover the entire tree, obscuring the trunk at times. Like the American plum, the Canadian plum does produce suckers, but these can be easily controlled. Our third plum we will cover is called the Mexican plum, or Prunus mexicana. It's distributed throughout the eastern and central U.S., just shy of Canada, although it's most abundant in the states of Arkansas, Missouri, and Louisiana. It shares much of its range with the American plum, and even some parts with the Canadian. The Mexican plum's leaves are often drooping, but generally resemble those of the American and Canadian plums when not drooping. The Mexican plum blooms in late winter, releasing its fragrant burst of flowers very early in the season. This means that in colder climates, a bad frost could hinder or even wipe out your fruit crop completely, as these trees generally are only hardy to -5 degrees Fahrenheit. The bark is generally more jagged than that of other native plums, even in its youth. The buds are inconspicuous and not quite useful for differentiating between the other wild plums. The young fruits are white in the summertime, but later turn deep purples and reds in the fall. They, like the American and Canadian, are roughly 1 inch wide and used in preserves or eaten raw. The Mexican plum differs from the other native plums in that it does not produce significant amounts of basal sprouts. This makes it a valuable rootstock used to graft commercial varieties too, as it is mostly resistant to New World diseases that could potentially kill any ungrafted non-native plums. The fourth plum we'll cover is called the Chickasaw plum, or Prunus angustifolia. It's distributed throughout much of the southeastern and south-central U.S., and can be found from Florida to Kansas. To identify the Chickasaw plum, you're going to have to look at the leaves. The buds look very similar to the other plums, and the branches may have thorns on them like the others. Leaves in general have red-tinted petioles, finely toothed and are pointed, but to less an extent than the other plums. The bark is similar to the other plums, having lead cells when young and getting plated when mature. The fruit of the Chickasaw plum is about 1/2 inch to 1 inch wide and turns red when ripe. Like the 3 previously mentioned plums, it's used in jams, jellies, and eaten raw. Prunus angustifolia, the Chickasaw plum, readily hybridizes with other native plums, like especially the American. It grows to be very twiggy and has almost a black bark, and has been shown to have self-fruiting properties, so it will not need another companion tree to produce fruit. The first of the lesser-known wild plums we will cover is the Allegheny plum, or Prunus allegheniensis. It's distributed in a much smaller range than the others, only existing in small pockets of the states surrounding Virginia and Pennsylvania. As well as having a much smaller distribution, the Allegheny plum, or Prunus allegheniensis, has a much smaller fruit, only being about 1/2 inch wide and turning reddish-purple at maturity. The leaves are finely toothed like the other plums, and in spring they're covered in white blooms like the other plums. The species of plum is much rarer than the others, so if you find it, consider yourself lucky. The next plum on our list is called the Oklahoma plum, or Prunus gracilis. It's distributed throughout the south-central U.S., but mainly focused in Texas and Oklahoma. It's generally not prized for eating because of its pulpiness, but the Native Americans did dry it and eat it during the winter. It grows in small thickets and rarely gets over 6 feet tall, instead producing lots of basal sprouts and flowers. The third lesser-known plum is called the Hortulin plum, or Prunus hortulana. It's distributed throughout the central and eastern U.S., but mostly settled in Missouri and Illinois. The Hortulin plum has many uses. The leaves can be made into green-gray dye, the fruit is edible and sweet, and the wood is strong and resilient. One of the most underappreciated plums on this list by far. The fruit usually appears in pairs, like cherries. The fourth plum on our not-so-well-known list is the beach plum, or Prunus maritima. It's distributed throughout the northeastern U.S., mainly hugging the coast. The beach plum is unique when compared to the other plums in that its fruit is very often spotted and its twigs are heavily dotted with lenticels. It does grow on beaches, but also thrives in meadows and fields. It's also unique in that it does not have thorns. Several cultivars are being bred at Cornell University. The fifth wild, lesser-known plum we're going to cover is called the wild goose plum, or Prunus monsoniana. For some reason, a lot of these plums are called wild goose. I don't know why. If you do know why, tell me. But that's the only common name I could find for this one, so I would try to use the Latin name for it if you're going to use it. Its native range is centered around where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers meet, but it also has large populations on the border of Kansas and Missouri. Prunus monsoniana shares many characteristics with the other wild plums native to the area. The only main difference is that the fruit is a yellowish tinge when ripe instead of perfectly red. The creek plum, or Prunus rivularis, is number 6 on our list. It's distributed mainly in central Texas, but also in much smaller quantities in the surrounding northern states. The fruit of the creek plum is reported to taste bitter, being largely unappealing to humans but providing a good food source for wildlife. It grows in well-drained, sandy soils and its native range, and the leaves can be used to make various dyes. Number 7 on our list is the Oregon/Pacific/Klamath/Sierra plum. It has 4 common names, if you would believe it. And its Latin name is Prunus subcordata. The Oregon plum is the farthest west wild true plum that I could find. It has a relatively small native range, only existing on a thin strip between Oregon and California. And this native range can cover the high mountains or the low valleys, and it's very adaptable to various climates. The Klamath plum produces small, but not choice, but still edible fruits that range from a ½ inch to 1 inch in diameter. Its leaves are less visibly toothed than most other plums, but still possess teeth. The bark is similar in appearance to cherry. The 8th plum on our list is called the flatwoods, or the slow plum. Its Latin name is Prunus umbellata. It's distributed and widespread along the coastal southeastern and south-central U.S. The flatwoods plum produces very few root suckers, unlike most other wild and domesticated plums. It has thorns like most others, and is helpful to pollinators with its very showy spring flowers. The last of our lesser-known wild plums is called the peach bush, or Prunus texana. And the peach bush has possibly the smallest range of any wild plum we've seen so far, only existing in a handful of southern Texas counties. It's classified as near threatened and is very rare in the wild. The fruit of the peach bush resemble those of peaches, but are actually more closely related to those of wild plums. The fruits ripen in June and is edible to humans and wildlife alike. The fruits are egg-shaped and yellow to greenish-yellow when ripe. It readily hybridizes with other wild and domesticated plums. The first of the 2 endangered plums on this list is the scrub plum, or Prunus geniculata.
Native to Florida, the scrub plum only exists in a few pockets of the state, about half of the population existing on protected land and the other half on private land. The fruit gets up to an inch wide and is bitter to humans. The last plum on our list is the second endangered plum and has a common name of Murray's plum. The Latin name is Prunus murrayana. Native to a small part of western Texas, this is by far the rarest plum on the list. No one has seen this tree fruit since 1928, when it was first documented. It is classified as critically endangered, but as far as I can tell, there's no effort to save it as of 2020. If you live in its native range, I would highly recommend trying to find one and propagating them to help save them in their natural habitat. With this video, I hope I either introduced, educated, or furthered your knowledge regarding the wild plums of North America. I highly encourage you to seek out wild plums in your area, as they are great sources for food, have beautiful flowers, and can create living hedges that house abundances of wildlife. The best part about all of this is basically wherever you live in the U.S., there's at least one native species of wild plum for you to forage for. If you're wondering about which species is for you, you can go on the iNaturalist app. This isn't sponsored, I just love the app and I use it a ton. And you can look up wild plums in my area and by species, and it'll show you where they are, their GPS location, and what they look like. Thank you for taking the time and listening to this whole video. It took a lot of effort, and I knew it would be helpful for people like me that are interested in wild fruit trees. If you like my content, consider subscribing, as I will continue to study, research, and plant native trees. Remember to grow native and have a good one.